So thanks for joining us this evening, morning, afternoon, whatever applies in your local time zone. I'm Erik Tollerud. I'm the project scientist of the Data Analysis Tools branch at Space Telescope, and I wanted to talk about this work we've been doing on data analysis tools for visualization using the Jupyter platform. So I'm going to start out, and then Brian is going to follow up in the second half. Maybe Brian, can you turn on your video for a second and wave? Say hello.
Hello.
So you'll see Brian in just a moment. But I'm going to start out by introducing this idea of the Jupyter platform, Jupyter Notebooks, and where we're going with this stuff. So let me start by making sure we're on the same page about what Jupyter Notebooks are, right? What Jupyter as a platform is. So if you haven't used Jupyter at all, that's perfectly fine. But so I want to introduce this idea. So in the words of Project Jupyter, the Jupyter Notebook, the sort of most visible part of the Jupyter platform, is an open source web application that lets you create and share documents with code, equations, visualizations, and narrative text. So that really says very clearly what it is, but I like to think about it from a sort of astronomy or similar data-intensive science perspective as being two different things. The first is that it's a way for you as the researcher to explore data in the same place as you record your results. You might think about this as sort of like a lab notebook. You know, if you're used to sort of a lab science, that's a thing everybody swears by, but in astronomy, at least in some corners of astronomy, we don't really use lab notebooks. And for me, at least as a researcher, it serves in that role, right? And I think it emphasizes the whole idea that it's really for both the present you and the future you, because it's your lab notebook that lets you go back and find out 6 months later, oh, what was I doing again? Because I know that's what I do 6 hours later, for that matter. I definitely find myself doing that all the time. Or another way of thinking about it is it lets you fail fast or succeed fast, but have the why of how that worked out embedded in the same place as the results, so that you don't have to sort of keep track of those two things separately. And then that gets to the second related concept, that it's also a way to transmit that scientific story as a sort of single piece of code, visualization, description, all rolled together into one. You can sort of think of this as maybe a paper that can write itself, or maybe a section of a paper is maybe a clearer way of thinking about it. But again, in my experience, that's often really aimed at you, future you, as the person who really wants to see this. But in many cases, it also works well as a way to transmit that information to your colleagues or other members of the scientific community. All right, and that last bit is a secondary part of what notebooks help with, and shows why it might be useful to figure out how to embed even more of your workflow in Jupyter Notebooks, which is what these visualization tools are about. Notebooks can work as tools for scientific reproducibility. So taking that idea of a section in a file to the extreme, you could imagine writing your whole paper in a Jupyter Notebook, and then it's sort of complete reproducibility in one nice simple package. In that sense, you can say at the top of your notebook, here's what I need to make the notebook run, make plots and all the numbers available to the readers, and they can even fiddle with it, making a fully reproducible publication in this sort of single format form. You can see sort of a very not well thought out example of this in a paper I wrote a few years back, which isn't to highlight the value of that paper per se, but just that it shows the idea that you can write a normal traditional paper and have at the bottom of it, if you want to reproduce any of the analysis, follow this link, and it takes you to a set of notebooks that essentially do exactly that. And part of why this is valuable is basically, at least in my head when I'm acting as a researcher, is that it gives us a way as researchers to outsource some of the sort of hard parts of maintaining our scientific infrastructure to software engineers who can sort of specialize in that. Most notably, I think, is the concept of continuous integration, or notebook CI, which you just see an example of as implemented for the JWST data analysis tools. So these are notebooks that demonstrate how to use the data analysis tools for the James Webb Space Telescope. And you can see this is just a screenshot of a website of one of those notebooks happily running, executing, and you can see build website. So in the process of any update to the notebook, it automatically builds a website and sends it off to where it's supposed to go, with a green check mark, meaning it worked out, it actually executed correctly. And that's all possible because the whole thing was embedded in a notebook, and all of the wider world of data science now has the power to um, enable all of that work. But the thing to keep in mind about this is that that also makes it easy to transition this into this more like knowledge sharing approach, either for the future you or for other users of your work to sort of learn what you've been doing. And indeed, that's, as I just said a moment ago, exactly what we've been trying to do with the JWST data analysis tools. But a similar approach is being taken by the AstroPy project, where the Learn AstroPy effort is primarily built around individual notebooks that operate as self-contained tutorials. Now, all of this is great and tells a nice story. The problem is not all scientific workflows, especially not all astronomy scientific workflows, really can work in this sort of static text form. So enter what we're talking about here, which is the interactive notebooks. So that's all about this use of extending the idea of Jupyter beyond just a notebook and into sort of a platform, you might say. So to do that, I can no longer talk about Jupyter by itself, because so Jupyter can be used with many different languages, many different sets of software. But now to reach this level of sort of interactive work, I have to specialize down into the tools that we're developing, both at Space Telescope and in the wider ecosystem. In particular, I'm going to emphasize the Python-based tools built on the AstroPy project, because those provide the underlying libraries that the visualization tools can use. And then on top of that, we're using, on top of that and on top of Jupyter, we're using a set of tools that are built on this IPyWidgets effort, which is part of Jupyter, but is essentially aimed at making something like this, where you can write simple Python-like functions and automatically get out nice little website-like check marks and slider bars that work nicely within a modern web context and in Jupyter Notebooks, most critically. We marry those together with the GLUE multidimensional data exploration tool, which again is written in Python, but has a Jupyter layer on top of it that lets you easily connect astronomy-like data sets to the visualization tools that work with Jupyter. And finally, the Voila tool, which lets you build standalone web applications, which might seem different, but as you'll find out in another 5 or 10 minutes, is actually really important to allowing a lot of the work we're talking about here. So all of that is brought together in this Python package called JDaViz. So these are also sometimes called the Viz tools, because they emphasize the point that primarily the Jupyter portion of it is about the visualization elements of this, that they're designed to be interactive visualizations that run in Jupyter. As it turns out, though, we realized quickly into developing them, they're not just useful in Jupyter Notebooks. With just a little bit of work, in particular leveraging that Voila tool I just mentioned, they turn out to work well looking like desktop applications as well. I'll show you an example of that in just a few minutes. And on top of that, as Brian will tell you, they can be embedded really well in websites, all with sort of the same underlying tool being shown to you as the user, so that you only have to learn how to use it once. You don't have to learn a separate set of interactive tools for your notebooks, for your sort of quick look desktop applications, and in a website like hypothetically MAST. So again, these tools, this JDaViz tool does all of those things as a layer on top of this GLUE Jupyter, tool, which brings a lot of this stuff together and provides a way to connect the data and the interactive plots with each other. As I've said a couple times, but now bears really emphasizing, even though these tools were built for JWST, it is not meant to be only useful for Space Telescope data or just JWST data. In fact, it's a feature, not a bug, that's true, because JWST is still not in space, and that means we want ways for you, the users, to potentially test these tools. So there's already loaders for all kinds of ground-based data sets, which you can explore if you want by just either. Obviously you can't follow the links you see on the screen, but you could just Google JDaViz and you'll find it. the current implementation, as indicated by these three logos, has three main visualization tools, which I'll go through in just a second, for 1D, 2D, and 3D spectroscopic visualization. But the key thing to bear in mind about this is that even though those are the ones we've implemented because that's what's most pressing for JWST, the whole concept is that it's more like a visualization toolbox. So the whole thing is built around the idea that even though those three were relevant for the Space Telescope team, there's no reason individual scientists or teams of scientists or teams of engineers from other observatories can't put things together and build their own configuration, their own tools that look like that function like these do, but with a different scientific application in mind. So with that big picture part in mind, let me just take a minute or two to step in on each of these three tools: SpecViz, QViz, and MOSViz. So SpecViz is one you might recognize as an idea. If you're used to IRAF, you might recognize it as looking vaguely like Splot, at least in concept. So it's the sort of simplest idea of just a single one-dimensional spectrum, and in fact, the primary set of goals for all the plugins and the little data analysis widgets, like the one you see on the right here, is to reproduce all of the things that the scientists on our team recognize as being important for the Splot tool. So it'll let you do things like make selections and ask what's the flux in that line, do background subtraction, pretty much anything you're used to using if you're used to Splot or other sort of quick 1D spectroscopic visualization tools will work with SpecViz. So that's its remit. Then QViz is going all the way to the other side of sort of the most complicated spectroscopic data set, is aimed at data cubes, which JWST will produce many of. And what you can see here is that it's showing you sort of three views into a data cube: the flux array, this is the mask, I think, forget now, and then this is the uncertainty, or perhaps this is the mask and this is the uncertainty, I can't remember now. But the key point is it shows all three of those with a slider bar that lets you slide through them like any sort of cube viewer, and embedded within it is also that same SpecViz tool that we were looking at just a moment ago. So it has all the same functionality that SpecViz does, but you can make selections in, the let's say in the flux space, and then it'll show you just that slice through the spectrum. Then the last tool I just want to mention as being already in existence is this MOSViz tool, which is primarily aimed at multi-object spectrograph data sets. So what you're looking at here, again, is the same SpecViz as a 1D spectrum, but also a 2D spectrum, because many spectrographs output that as a useful check for whether there's, say, cosmic rays or whatever. There's also a table that lets you show, if you have a multi-object spectrograph, all of the slits that are in that mask, let's say. And then it has an optional view that will show you, oh, that's actually the object I was looking at. And, that's, say, this is a box. That's something, so that's not quite the simplest example, but, would show you the slit over top, essentially. So that's MOSViz. So that's the three primary viz tools that we've developed so far. And now the last thing I want to highlight before passing on to Brian is also that all of those tools are essentially two tools in one, because not only can you load them in a notebook, like I'm showing you on the left, with sort of basic Python commands like load your data, show it here. You can also make it look just like a desktop application, which you can see just by comparing these two that it's the same thing. It's implemented the same way. It looks very similar in interface, but in this case, it's a standalone thing that I invoked on the command line by just typing specviz space spec.fits, whereas this one is embedded as part of a notebook workflow. So you can use either idiom that makes sense to you. If you speak Python, you might want to use the notebook, but if you don't, you can just use it as though it's your DS9 for Spectra. And then at that, I want to hand it off to Brian, because Brian will also show you how the same concept can be embedded in MAST. Are you there, Brian? You were there just a moment ago.
Uh-oh, she's still here? Looks like he got kicked off. Let me see.
Okay, I think he's back. I'm going to move him up to co-host just to make it a little easier for him, just in case.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had an issue with my screen share. So you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. And how do I get rid of that thing? Okay. And okay. Okay. And present. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about how the how and why we are integrating JDaViz with MAST. And so before I get to the how, I want to talk about the why. And the main reason is when I talk about MAST, I'm talking about the MAST portal. The MAST portal is the main entry point for astronomers to search for data curated by Space Telescope. And one of the primary drivers of this integration came about when we collected feedback from the community on what they wanted to see in a web-based spectroscopic viewer. The list of features that they came back with was almost exactly the same set of features they wanted in a desktop tool. And so the question became, why should we develop two separate things? How can we develop a tool that can be used in both places? And by doing that, it will allows us to streamline the user experience and workflow from the MAST sort of website or any website really to a local sort of more nuanced scientific analysis or scientific platform. And then because this is a generic spectral tool, it can be used anywhere in any web that has, where spectra. So the MAST portal, right, is the online hub for searching the astronomy archive. And when you do a search in the portal, what you will see, this is all in development at the moment. So in this example screenshot, you see a search on JWST observations, and for rows where there's some relevant data products that can be loaded in JDaViz, you'll see an icon called JDA, and if you click on it, you see one link option that says open the default data product in a web page, and then you can also select which files to open. And this is for the case where there are multiple data products associated with that observation. So in the case where you click open the default data file, you're brought directly to this visualization page where on the left-hand side, you see some information about the data product that you've opened up. And then embedded in the middle is JDaViz. And in this particular screenshot, it's this is a test JWST MIRI IFU data cube. So this is the CubeViz sort of application embedded directly into the MAST website. If you were to select the other option of select which files to open, you're brought to sort of a separate page, which gives you all the data products associated with that observation. And then you can click on any of them to visualize them in that same sort of quick look page. And then I want to just highlight the framework for the web integration. And it's very similar. It uses all the same technologies that Erik was talking about. On the right-hand side here, you see this group of Python analysis tools. You'll have some data. You might write some notebooks, and you can use JDaViz inside that notebook. And then, you can serve those notebooks with a Jupyter server. And then the new piece here is some communication layer and connection layer that sort of integrates components and cells from the notebook into the MAST web frontend or any web frontend. And so the user can come in on the browser side, or they can just use the Python analysis tools And so if you imagine connecting the dots between the two user purple blocks, you can see this seamless workflow from the web side of things down into the notebook side of things. And so I want to briefly just show a video. Can you see this video?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is a video in the portal of doing a search for JWST data. I'm doing an advanced search. There are multiple ways in the portal to search for observations in JWST data products. So this interface will look slightly different from than the screenshot you saw. So I'm doing a search for MIRI observations in this JWST instrument keyword collection. And so it returns rows of data products. And I'm filtering here on cube data products. And you'll see an icon that appears that says visualize the spectra in CubeViz. So this is letting you know that you can open this data product directly in the viewer. And so it will take a moment to load. Now what it's doing is it's talking to a Jupyter Notebook and extracting the individual cell content that contains the JDaViz tool and loads that data. And so on the left, again, is all this sort of metadata and data associated with the data product with the descriptors. And this is all pulled from the MAST portal. And then, you know, JDaViz is the main tool, and you have the full interactive capability that you would get running this in the notebook. So here I've selected a subset. On the right is a plugin tray with analysis things that you can do. And so I think I'm going to just perform a little Gaussian smooth on the spectrum. And you see I get a little success message. And now the data is displayed here. I can check it and uncheck the other data to just display the smooth spectrum. So this is all on the web, but you can also click this Open Data in Jupyter button, and that will download a Jupyter Notebook. And once it loads, you'll see you get a Jupyter Notebook. So this is an automatically generated notebook that will download the data file that you were just looking at in the web and will load the relevant JDaViz tool. And so in this case, it's a CubeViz. And so it loads now completely in the notebook. And it's the full interactive sort of feature set. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to give it back to Erik, who is going to show another video with a little bit more nuance on the web to notebook connection.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Right, so I'm gonna sort of pick up where that left off, essentially, right? This is the exact same thing, the exact same example that you were seeing before. That Brian was just showing you of going into this version of MAST that shows a bunch of possible data products, but also included in that are several that are 1D spectra, right? These little logos are different. We'll pick one here and we'll open it up. It does the exact same thing Brian was just showing you, where it loads up in the visualization tools. And now, because this is engineering data, this is not a perfect example, but it's illustrating what it would look like if it were actual data, where you might find a spectral line and be interested in studying something about the spectral line. So you can go and make a selection. Let's just pretend like this is an actual spectral line. You can see I do a few things that show you a bunch of information you might want out of your spectral line. You know, let's say the centroid, exactly where that line is might be important to you. But if you're an astronomer, you're probably like, oh, I don't like the way that they did that calculation, right? I care a lot about, say, the baseline is wrong. So the way this works then is you go in, you do this open in Jupyter example, which then downloads the file. This is, again, exactly what this part of it was exactly what Brian was showing you before. You pull it up on your own desktop, move the file to the right place. Type, if you're like me, you always mistype the file name the first time. Then you pull it up in the notebook, and you can get the exact same thing that you just saw in MAST. Again, just the way Brian showed you. But in this case, since it's a 1D spectrum, we can do this straightforward thing of zooming right back in and identifying the same spectral line interactively, because that's sort of the easiest way to find some sort of obvious lines like this. And now I can say, I know of a better way to do this. I have my preferred way of doing this, but let me first make sure I can reproduce the way that the visualization tool is doing it. So you're going to see a few magic incantations here that are basically amount to documented ways of pulling out the data from the visualization tool into your notebook. That's the way to get the spectrum itself out. This is the way to choose the regions you just selected right now. That area right there is what I mean by that. Indeed, it pulls out what the thing you interactively selected in your notebook. And that lets you do something first that's exactly what the tool that I was seeing in the website was doing, which is using the built-in centroiding tool. That's what this is doing right here. That's the same number we saw a moment ago on MAST. But now you say, wait a minute, but I can see that the baseline is wrong, and centroiding actually requires a proper baseline. So what do I do about that? Just by eye, I'm going to pull out, takes a second to type here, but pull out a little region, figure out what the lowest value is, because that's probably the baseline of that particular spectrum. Then I'm going to take the centroid of the spectrum minus the base. And now I got a different answer. That's what I meant to do, right? That's the true centroid. So the whole point of this example is that it demonstrates how, even though that's not something anyone would want to code into MAST because it's very particular to this data set, by gluing these pieces together, you end up with something where the same tool set that works in a place like MAST in a very controlled environment, you can inject your own scientific knowledge and start using it the same way you'd use the sort of scripts and Python code you might use for your own workflow, intertwined with the visualization tool itself. So that was the main point of what we wanted to share here. I think that's the end of the presentation part of this. I think, Brian, do you have anything else you want to add before we open the floor for questions?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. So then I think we can open the floor for questions.
Can I ask a question? In these workflows, because a lot of these data products have uncertainties associated with them, how are those handled in the workflows? Are those passed off to higher level activities in Jupyter Notebooks?
The short version of that is, yes, it's passed on to the higher level or lower level, depending on the way you look at it. The actual libraries. So the visualization tools generally don't do anything special with uncertainties. We have planned, it's already, actually, I think it might even be in the dev version now, but there's a near-term plan to add showing of uncertainties for the 1D spectra, because that's already fairly straightforwardly built into the data structures that underlie all of this. And then, and as I think I showed already in JDWST, the uncertainty cube is a thing that you can just view and is by default shown as part of JDWST. But and many of the analysis tools, like the operations that I showed on the side, like the centroiding, will be aware of an uncertainty if it's there. But what is not there, because it's so data dependent, is a way to sort of produce your own uncertainties or understand the uncertainties beyond just whatever was in the file you loaded into it. It doesn't know how to do that. There's really no way to do that without an individual user injecting their own feeling of the uncertainties. But most of the libraries have something built in already.
I've got a question. What are your plans, or what do you have for dealing with large data sets? Like, say I have a spectral data cube that's tens of gigabytes. I'm not going to download it directly in my browser. Do you support that? Are you going to support that?
Yeah, so it depends on which of the interfaces we're talking about now. So in the notebook or sort of quick look interface, because that's all running on your local computer anyway, in some sense, it has to be supported on your laptop. You're going to have to download it. So like the example I showed here of first opening MAST and then downloading it, after I did the download, the first step was basically download the data from MAST. So that part of it, you really do have to download onto your laptop. That said, and Brian can say more about this if he wants to, but the MAST example goes and pulls the data from inside of MAST, right? So that problem is sort of solved intrinsically in a use case like that. And relatedly, if you've got a Jupyter Hub instance, as opposed to what all the examples I'm showing here are you running Jupyter on your own computer, but if there's a Jupyter Hub instance or a science platform, those would then be optimized to use these tools, because the only thing that then gets transmitted is the image you see on your browser rather than the full data set. The full data set just lives wherever the kernel lives, which doesn't have to be on the same computer that's viewing the website. I don't know if Brian wanted to add any more there.
No, I think that was pretty good.
Maybe I
All
can go
right.
next.
Yes,
Have a
I was about to
question?
say, Katharina, you're up next.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So that looks really cool. Thank you. I was just wondering, in the JDWST tool, can you kind of rotate the cube to say, look at the XZ or YZ side of the cube?
Yes, but of course there's always a but. Yes, but it doesn't really, it would, in the current state of affairs, it would probably break some things. So like let me put it a different way. The visualization tool supports that, but some of the extra things like the slider bar, actually I think the slider bar will work, but like the plugins that were on the side, like the thing that lets you do the centroid and Spectrum 1D, there's also like smoothing of the cubes. That kind of stuff might break once you do that, because there's sort of assumptions baked in that the view you're seeing is the view that was designed into the tool. But peeking behind the curtain, actually all of that is possible with Glue Jupyter, and all you have to do is sort of break out of the default view that the JDaViz provides you, and you can reorient the cube whatever way you want. You can sort of redo the units of the axes. All of that is possible. It's just some of the plugins might break right now if you do that and then follow on to do other things.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question. And Chris Willett has his hand raised.
Hi, yeah. I was wondering what's the schedule for IMVIS being available, and whether it's going to have a lot of the functionality we're used to from DS9.
Great question that I cannot give you a straight answer on, but I can give you a hand-wavy answer of some of the functionality you're used to will be in the next release, which is scheduled for March. I can't remember for sure. Anyway, in the near future, that will use the same underlying architecture as what you're seeing here, but the image visualizer will be based on something that's a little bit more already developed, essentially, right? So like, well, anyway, I don't want to go down the technical rabbit hole, but I think the short answer is some of the key features should be there for the first release, and we have sort of a prioritized list that you can see in the JDaViz issue tracker, in fact, of things that we will want to be adding after that first release. And whether your particular favorite DS9 feature is on that list or not remains to be seen, because DS9 is full of a lot of things. It's in fact one of the largest code bases in all of astronomy. So don't expect everything to be there, but expect some of the key elements that are sort of the basic DS9 workflow to be there in the first release.